I thought my 18th birthday would be about freedom, independence, maybe even a car. Instead, I watched my stepbrother Marcus carry his Xbox into my bedroom while Dad stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, telling me I had exactly 2 hours to pack everything and move into the garage. "You're an adult now, Jessica. Time to act like one." 3 weeks later, Dad was dead, and the lawyer was reading words that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The smell of vanilla candles and fresh paint still lingered in our Phoenix suburban home when Dad dropped the bomb that would reshape my entire world. I was sprawled across my bed, scrolling through college acceptance letters, when he knocked on my doorframe with that particular rhythm that meant serious business. "Jess, we need to talk." David Martinez had always been a man of few words, but the weight behind these four made my stomach clench. I set down the letter from Arizona State, my dream school, the one I'd been saving for since I was 14, and gave him my full attention. "Your stepmother and I have been discussing the living arrangements," he began, not quite meeting my eyes. "With you turning 18 next month and Marcus needing more space for his gaming setup." I felt the blood drain from my face. Marcus Thompson, Linda's 17-year-old son, who'd moved in 2 years ago when Dad remarried, had been eyeing my room since day one. It was the largest bedroom upstairs, with 2 windows overlooking our backyard pool and enough space for my art easel, bookshelf, and the vintage desk Dad had bought me for my 16th birthday. "You're giving him my room?" The words came out sharper than I intended. Dad's jaw tightened. "You're going to be an adult, Jessica. Adults don't live in their childhood bedrooms forever. The garage has been converted. It's got its own entrance, a bathroom, even a mini kitchen area. It's practically an apartment." The garage, the cold, concrete space where we stored Christmas decorations and Dad's old motorcycle. Sure, Linda had spent the last month having it renovated, but it was still the garage. It was still exile from the main house, from the family I thought I belonged to. "What about when I come home from college? Where am I supposed to stay then?" "We'll figure that out when the time comes." His tone suggested the conversation was over, but I wasn't ready to surrender. "Dad, this is my home. I've lived in that room for 6 years, since Mom died and we moved here. All my memories, my stuff, which you can take with you to your new space." Linda's voice cut through our conversation like a blade. She appeared beside Dad, her perfectly manicured hand resting on his shoulder with practiced possession. "Marcus needs room for his computer station and his music equipment. He's got real talent, you know. This could be his big break." Marcus's talent consisted of streaming video games to 12 followers and making beats on software Dad had bought him for Christmas. Meanwhile, my art had won 3 regional competitions, but somehow that never warranted extra space. "I think you're being dramatic, honey," Linda continued, her smile never reaching her eyes. "The garage is beautiful now, very modern, very independent. Isn't that what 18-year-olds want?" Independence. The word tasted bitter when it was being used to justify my exile. I looked at Dad, searching for any sign that he might reconsider, that he might remember who I was before Linda and Marcus entered our lives. But his expression had already shifted into that closed-off mask he wore whenever Linda spoke. "It's decided, Jess. Marcus will move in after your birthday party next weekend." My 18th birthday party, the one I'd been planning for months, the one where I was going to announce my college choice to all my friends. Now, it would be my going-away party too, apparently. That night, I called my best friend Maya Chen while packing my art supplies into boxes. "He's seriously making you move to the garage?" Maya's voice crackled through my earbuds as I wrapped my paintings in bubble wrap. "The converted garage," I corrected bitterly. Linda keeps calling it my young adult space, like it's some kind of upgrade. "This is insane, Jess. Can't you talk to your dad alone, without Linda there?"
I paused in my packing. When was the last time I'd had a real conversation with Dad without Linda hovering nearby? She had this way of inserting herself into every interaction, steering conversations toward Marcus's achievements or her own opinions about what was best for the family.
I don't think he sees me anymore, I admitted, the words surprising me with their truth. Ever since he married Linda, it's like I'm this obligation he has to manage, rather than his daughter. What about your mom's family? Your grandmother in Tucson? Grandma Elena. I hadn't seen her in almost 2 years, not since Linda decided that holiday visits should be nuclear family only. She'd phrased it as wanting to establish their own traditions, but I knew better. Linda didn't like sharing Dad's attention with reminders of his first marriage. Maybe I should call her, I said, more to myself than to Maya. The next morning, I found Dad in his home office, buried in spreadsheets from his accounting firm. For a moment, he looked like the man I remembered from before Linda. Focused, serious, but approachable. My dad. Hey, can we talk about the room situation again? He didn't look up from his computer. Jessica, we've been over this. The decision is made. But Dad, I've been thinking about what you said, about being an adult and all that. If I'm old enough to live independently, shouldn't I have some say in how that independence looks? Now he glanced up, wariness creeping into his expression. What do you mean? I mean, maybe I could move in with Grandma Elena for the summer, help her around the house, get a job in Tucson. Real independence, not just the garage. The reaction was immediate and intense. Dad's face darkened, and he pushed back from his desk so abruptly that his chair hit the wall behind him. Absolutely not. Why not? You said I needed to act like an adult. Your grandmother is a manipulative woman who never approved of Linda, and I won't have you running to her with stories about how terrible your life is here. His words hit me like a slap. Grandma Elena? Manipulative? The woman who taught me to paint watercolors and told me stories about Mom's childhood? The woman who sent me birthday cards with handwritten notes about how proud she was of my achievements? She's not manipulative, Dad. She's my grandmother, and she loved Mom. Don't. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Don't use your mother's memory to guilt me into decisions that aren't in this family's best interest. This family. The phrase stung because I was beginning to understand that Linda and Marcus were this family, and I was something else entirely. Something left over from his previous life that needed to be managed, contained, gradually phased out. Linda appeared in the doorway as if summoned by the tension in the room. She had an uncanny ability to materialize whenever Dad and I were alone together. Everything's fine, Dad said quickly, his tone shifting to that careful neutral he used around her. Jessica was just sharing some ideas about her summer plans. Oh, how wonderful! What were you thinking, sweetie? The endearment made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to answer civilly. I thought maybe I could spend some time with my grandmother in Tucson. Linda smiled for just a fraction of a second before reassembling itself. Elena, right? Your father mentioned her. She's quite elderly, isn't she? Might be a lot of responsibility for someone just starting their adult life. She's 68 and perfectly healthy, I replied, watching Linda's face carefully. There was something calculating in her expression, something that made me think she knew exactly why I wanted to leave. Still, I think staying close to family is important during these transitional years. Don't you agree, David? Dad nodded without really looking at either of us. Jessica will be staying here for the summer. She can look for a job locally, maybe take some community college courses to get ahead. The finality in his voice made it clear the conversation was over. But I had one more card to play. What about Mom's things? I asked quietly. The stuff in storage? Can I at least go through those before I move to the garage? Linda's perfectly composed expression cracked just slightly. I'd hit something, though I wasn't sure what. Those boxes are mostly old clothes and papers, nothing that would interest someone your age. They're my mother's belongings, I pressed. I should be able to decide what interests me. Dad looked between Linda and me, something shifting in his face. For a moment, I thought he might actually side with me.
might remember that those boxes contained pieces of the woman he'd loved before Linda.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "We'll discuss it later," he said finally, which was Dad speak for, "No, but I don't want to fight about it right now." Later never came. That weekend, my birthday party unfolded like a performance I hadn't rehearsed for. Linda had taken over the planning, transforming my simple backyard gathering into an elaborate affair with catered food and decorations that felt more like her aesthetic than mine. She'd even invited some of Marcus's friends, who spent the entire time huddled around his gaming setup in what was still technically my room. "This is so nice," my friend Claire commented, admiring the professional floral arrangements Linda had ordered. "Your stepmom really went all out." I nodded and smiled, playing the grateful daughter role, while inside I felt like I was watching someone else's party. This wasn't how I'd imagined my 18th birthday, surrounded by Linda's choices, in a house that increasingly felt like I was just visiting. The final blow came during the gift opening ceremony that Linda had insisted on staging like a wedding reception. Dad handed me a professionally wrapped box with a card that read, "To our adult daughter," in Linda's handwriting. Inside was a set of luggage. "For all your future adventures," Linda beamed, as if she hadn't just given me the most passive-aggressive gift in history. Maya caught my eye from across the patio and raised her eyebrows in a "did that just happen" expression. I forced another smile and thanked them both, because what else could I do? Make a scene at my own birthday party? That night, after everyone had gone home and the caterers had cleaned up Linda's elaborate spread, I sat alone in my room, Marcus's future room, and stared at the luggage set. The message was crystal clear: pack up and move along. I was 18 now, officially an adult, but I'd never felt more powerless in my life. The move to the garage happened exactly as scheduled. Marcus hauled his gaming equipment into my former room with the enthusiasm of a conquering hero, while I relocated my entire life to the converted space that smelled faintly of motor oil, despite Linda's best efforts with paint and air fresheners. To her credit, Linda had done a decent job with the renovation. The concrete floors were covered with vinyl planking, the walls were painted a cheerful yellow that was supposed to feel sunny but mostly felt desperate. There was indeed a small bathroom and a kitchenette area with a mini fridge and microwave. It was functional, maybe even nice by some standards. But it wasn't home. The worst part wasn't the physical space, it was the psychological distance. Living in the garage meant I was no longer part of the daily rhythm of the house. I missed dinnertime conversations, morning coffee with Dad, even Linda's pointed comments about household chores. I was close enough to hear their lives continuing without me, but too far away to be included. Dad barely visited my new space, claiming he didn't want to intrude on my privacy. Linda stopped by occasionally with suggestions about decorating or organizing, but her visits felt more like inspections than genuine interest in my well-being. The isolation was suffocating. 3 weeks into my new living arrangement, everything changed in a way none of us could have predicted. Dad had been complaining about chest pains for a few days, dismissing them as work stress and too much coffee. Linda had been after him to see a doctor, which should have been my first clue that something was seriously wrong. Linda didn't usually encourage medical expenses. It happened on a Tuesday morning while I was getting ready for my job interview at a local art supply store. I heard commotion from the main house, shouting, then sirens. By the time I threw on clothes and ran inside, paramedics were already working on Dad in the living room where he'd collapsed. The heart attack was massive and sudden. He was gone before they got him to the hospital. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, casseroles from neighbors, and relatives I hadn't seen in years, offering condolences that felt hollow. Linda threw herself into the role of grieving widow with the same intensity she brought to everything else, organizing every detail of Dad's memorial, down to the flower arrangements. I moved through it all like a sleepwalker, numb with shock and grief that felt too large for my 18-year-old body to contain. My dad was gone.
The man who'd raised me alone after Mom died, who'd taught me to drive and helped with homework and made terrible pancakes every Sunday morning, he was simply gone. And I was alone with Linda and Marcus in a house that had never truly felt like home.
The will reading was scheduled for the Friday after the funeral. I almost didn't attend. Linda had made it clear that everything would go to her as the surviving spouse, and I wasn't sure I could handle sitting through the legal formalization of my displacement. But Grandma Elena called that morning, the first time I'd spoken to her since Dad's death. "Mija, you need to be there," she said in her strong, clear voice. "Your father was a complicated man, but he loved you. Trust me on this." Something in her tone made me reconsider. So I put on my only black dress, the one I'd worn to Dad's funeral, and drove to the law offices of Patterson, Wells and Associates for what I assumed would be the final chapter of my childhood. I had no idea I was about to discover that everything I thought I knew about my family was built on lies. The law offices of Patterson, Wells and Associates occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower downtown, all polished marble and intimidating leather furniture. I felt underdressed and out of place as the receptionist led us to a conference room where Dad's lawyer, Mr. Patterson, waited with a stack of documents that would reshape my understanding of everything. Linda swept in wearing designer black, Marcus trailing behind her in an ill-fitting suit that made him look even younger than 17. She'd been unusually quiet during the drive downtown, none of her typical chatter about traffic or the weather. Something about her silence felt different from grief, more anticipatory, like she was bracing for something. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Patterson began, adjusting his glasses as he opened the legal folder. "I know this is difficult, but David was very specific about how he wanted his affairs handled." He started with the standard legal language about sound mind and proper witnesses, but I barely listened. My attention kept drifting to the framed photo on his desk, Dad and Linda on their wedding day, both smiling broadly. I wasn't in that picture. None of Dad's life before Linda seemed to exist in this sterile office. "The first request is to Linda Thompson Martinez," Mr. Patterson continued. "David leaves you the house in Phoenix, along with his retirement accounts and life insurance policy, totaling approximately $450,000. Linda's exhale was audible, relief flooding her features. She'd gotten what she expected, what she'd probably been counting on during those long hospital hours. "To Marcus Thompson, David leaves his car collection and establishes a college fund of $75,000 with the condition that Marcus maintains a B average throughout his academic career." Marcus perked up at this. Dad's collection was just 2 classic Mustangs he'd been restoring, but they were worth decent money, and $75,000 would cover most of a state school education. I waited for my name, expecting some token gesture, maybe a few $1,000s or Dad's old photography equipment, something to acknowledge that I'd been his daughter first, before Linda redesigned our family. "Now, the more complex portion of the estate," Mr. Patterson continued, pulling out a separate document. "David established a trust fund 20 years ago, originally funded with proceeds from the sale of his first accounting firm. This trust has been growing and compounding for 2 decades. 20 years ago? That would have been right after he married Mom, when I was still a baby." Linda's expression shifted, confusion replacing satisfaction. "The trust is worth approximately $1.3 million, Mr. Patterson said, and Linda actually gasped. $1.3 million? I stared at the lawyer, trying to process the number. Dad had been comfortable but not wealthy, or so I'd thought. He drove a practical sedan, shopped at regular grocery stores, worried about college costs. Where did this money come from? The trust was established with specific instructions that it be kept separate from David's other assets. The beneficiary of this trust is Jessica Elena Martinez, his daughter, with full access beginning on her 21st birthday." The room went dead silent. I felt like all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. $1.3 million. Mine. Linda's face had gone completely white. "I'm sorry, what? That's impossible.
David never mentioned any trust fund. We discussed all our finances when we got married. There was no mention of over $1 million. The trust predates your marriage to David, Mr. Patterson replied calmly. It was established as a legacy for his daughter from his first marriage. David was very clear that this money was never to be considered part of the marital estate. But that's, Linda started, then stopped herself, clearly trying to recalculate everything she'd believed about her financial situation. Furthermore, Mr. Patterson continued, Jessica will receive immediate access to $50,000 for college expenses, and David has appointed her grandmother, Elena Martinez, as the trust administrator until Jessica reaches 21.
Grandma Elena. The woman Linda had spent 2 years gradually cutting out of our lives. I felt a strange mix of vindication and grief. Dad had been planning for my future, protecting it, even while appearing to side with Linda in every daily battle. There's one more thing, Mr. Patterson said, reaching for another document. David left specific instructions about his first wife's personal belongings, which have been in storage. Those items are to be released immediately to Jessica, along with all photographs and documents from his first marriage. Mom's things. The boxes Linda had dismissed as worthless. The memories she'd been guarding like state secrets. They were mine now, legally and officially. Linda found her voice, but it came out strained and higher than usual. This is highly irregular. I was David's wife. I should have been consulted about these arrangements. Mrs. Martinez, Mr. Patterson said, using her married name with careful emphasis, these arrangements predate your relationship with David. They were never subject to spousal consultation because they were never part of the marital assets. David was very explicit about maintaining this separation. I sat there trying to absorb what this meant. Dad had been protecting my future while appearing to prioritize Linda's present. Every time he'd sided with her in an argument, every time he'd dismissed my concerns about my place in the family, he'd been safeguarding something much larger. But why hadn't he told me? Why let me feel abandoned and displaced when he was actually ensuring I'd be secure? Marcus, who'd been silent throughout the reading, finally spoke up. So Jessica gets more money than Mom gets? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Linda shot him a sharp look, but the damage was done. The inequality was stark and undeniable. The trust reflects David's wishes for his daughter's long-term security, Mr. Patterson replied diplomatically. It was established when Jessica was an infant, funded with money David earned before his second marriage. Before you met Linda, I said, finally finding my voice. It wasn't a question. That's correct. Linda stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. I need some air. This is a lot to process. She swept out of the room, Marcus hurrying after her with a confused expression. I could hear their voices in the hallway, Linda's sharp whispers and Marcus's bewildered responses. Miss Martinez, Mr. Patterson said once we were alone, your father also left you this. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Dad's familiar handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Dad's precise script. Jessica, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for a lot of things, actually, but mostly I'm sorry for not being brave enough to tell you the truth while I was alive. Your mother and I established this trust when you were born because we wanted you to have security, education, choices. We wanted you to never feel trapped by circumstances the way we both had as young people. When your mother died, I was lost. I made decisions based on loneliness rather than wisdom. Linda offered companionship, stability for you, a complete family again. But I realize now that in trying to create that family, I lost sight of the one I already had, you and me. The trust was always meant to be yours. Your mother's belongings were always meant to be yours. I should have made this clear while I was alive, should have stood up for your place in our family instead of trying to keep peace with Linda. I know you probably feel like I chose them over you, especially with the room situation. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. I was trying to push you toward independence because I thought it would be good for you. But really, I was just taking the easy path, avoiding conflict with Linda.
Your grandmother Elena has been asking to see you. I kept making excuses because Linda felt threatened by my first marriage, by the reminders of your mother. I was wrong about that, too. Elena loves you, and she has stories about your mother that you deserve to hear. Be smart with the money, sweetheart. Use it for college, for your art, for whatever dreams you want to chase. But more importantly, use it for freedom. Use it to make choices based on what you want, not what other people expect from you. I love you. I always loved you. I just forgot how to show it. Dad. I read the letter twice, tears blurring the words by the end. Dad knew. He'd known exactly what was happening in our house, exactly how displaced I'd felt, and he'd been working behind the scenes to fix it in the only way he knew how, by securing my future.
Mr. Patterson cleared his throat gently. "There's also this," he said, handing me a business card. "Your grandmother's contact information. David asked me to give it to you directly." Elena Martinez, a Tucson address and phone number. The woman I'd been forbidden to visit, whose influence Linda had spent 2 years trying to eliminate from my life. "When can I access Mom's things?" I asked. "Immediately. I have the storage unit information right here. Your father paid the rent through the end of this year." I took the papers with numb fingers, still processing everything that had changed in the last 30 minutes. I was rich. Not wealthy exactly, but secure in a way I'd never imagined possible. I could go to any college I wanted, live anywhere I chose, never depend on Linda's hospitality again. More importantly, I could learn about my mother from someone who'd known her before Linda rewrote our family history. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you go to college, if that's what you want. You contact your grandmother if you want. You make decisions based on your own interests rather than other people's convenience." Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see Linda pacing in the hallway, her phone pressed to her ear. She looked agitated, probably calling someone to ask about the legality of surprise trust funds. "She didn't know?" I asked. Mr. Patterson shook his head. "Your father was very clear about maintaining privacy around the trust. He felt that knowledge of it might complicated family dynamics." That was one way to put it. If Linda had known I was inheriting over $1 million, would she have been so eager to exile me to the garage? Would she have worked so hard to distance me from Elena, knowing my grandmother would soon control my inheritance? "One more thing," Mr. Patterson said, gathering his papers. "Your father left specific instructions about the house. While it goes to Linda, you have the legal right to remain there until you graduate college or turn 21, whichever comes first." I could stay. Despite everything, despite the garage exile and the passive-aggressive birthday gifts, I could legally stay in that house for 3 more years if I wanted to. But as I watched Linda through the glass, saw her sharp gestures and the tight line of her mouth, I realized something important. I didn't want to stay. For the first time in 2 years, I had choices, real choices, backed by real resources, and I was going to use them. The drive back from the lawyer's office was suffocating. Linda gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white, while Marcus stared out the passenger window in stunned silence. I sat in the back seat, Dad's letter folded carefully in my purse alongside my grandmother's contact information, watching familiar Phoenix streets blur past. Nobody spoke until we pulled into our driveway. Inside. Linda's voice was clipped, controlled, but I could hear the fury simmering beneath the surface. "Over $1 million, she said, whirling to face me. "Over $1 million that your father hid from me for 2 years of marriage." "He didn't hide it," I replied, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "It was established before you even met him. It was never yours to know about." I was his wife. We shared everything. Finances, decisions, planning for the future. How could he not mention a trust fund worth more than our house? Marcus dropped onto the couch, still looking shell-shocked. "Mom, maybe Dad thought—" "Don't," Linda cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Don't make excuses for this betrayal." Betrayal? The word hung between us like an accusation. I felt something hot and defensive rise in my chest. Betrayal?
I stood up, meeting her glare head-on. You want to talk about betrayal? You spent 2 years systematically erasing my mother from this house, cutting me off from my grandmother, and convincing Dad to exile me to the garage the moment I turned 18? But Dad leaving me an inheritance is betrayal? Your father and I made decisions together about what was best for this family. This family, I interrupted, letting all my accumulated resentment pour into those 2 words. You keep saying that, like I was never really part of it, like you ever wanted me to be part of it. Linda's mask of composed grief finally cracked completely. You think I wanted to deal with a sullen teenager who resented every breath I took? You think I enjoyed walking on eggshells around your precious memories of Saint Catherine?
My mother's name hit me like a physical blow. Linda had never said it out loud before, had always referred to her as David's first wife when she bothered to acknowledge her existence at all. Don't you dare! She's dead, Jessica. She's been dead for 8 years. But your father could never move on because you wouldn't let him. Every family dinner was a comparison. Every holiday tradition had to account for what Catherine would have done. I couldn't redecorate a single room without hearing about how your mother had better taste. That's not true. But even as I said it, I wondered if it was. Had I been holding on to Mom's memory so tightly that I'd made it impossible for Dad to be happy? I tried to include you, Linda continued, her voice rising. I planned your birthday parties, helped with school projects, bought you clothes. You planned everything exactly how you wanted it, not how I wanted it. You helped with projects by redoing them your way. You bought me clothes that looked like something you would wear, not something I would choose. Because you chose nothing. You participated in nothing. You acted like every kindness I showed you was an insult to your mother's memory. The accusation stung because there was truth in it. I had resisted Linda's efforts, had viewed every gesture as an invasion rather than an attempt at connection. But I'd been 15 when she'd arrived, grieving and angry and protective of the life Dad and I had built together. Maybe I did resist, I admitted, but you never once asked what I needed. You just decided what would make us look like a normal family and forced everyone to go along with it. I was trying to give you stability. You were trying to replace my mother. The words exploded out of me with 8 years of suppressed fury behind them. Linda took a step back as if I'd struck her. I never tried to replace Catherine, she said quietly. I tried to be a mother to a girl who already had one, even a dead one. The cruelty of that last phrase sucked all the air out of the room. Marcus looked between us with growing panic, probably realizing this conversation was spiraling far beyond anything he could mediate. Get out, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Excuse me? Get out of my house, both of you. Linda's laugh was sharp and bitter. Your house? This is my house now, Jessica. The lawyer made that very clear. And he also made it very clear that I have the legal right to stay here until I'm 21. I pulled out the papers Mr. Patterson had given me, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system, which means I can make your life just as uncomfortable as you've made mine. For the first time since I'd known her, Linda looked genuinely unsettled. She glanced at Marcus, who was staring at his phone like he wished he could disappear into it. You wouldn't. Try me. I've got nothing left to lose, and apparently plenty of money to hire lawyers if you want to challenge Dad's will. The standoff stretched between us. 2 years of accumulated grievances finally laid bare. I could see Linda calculating, trying to figure out her next move now that the balance of power had shifted so dramatically. Fine, she said finally, but understand this. If you choose to stay here, you'll be staying as a guest in my home following my rules. And understand this, I replied. If you try to treat me the way you have been, I'll make sure every lawyer in Phoenix knows exactly how David Martinez's widow is honoring his final wishes. It was a threat, and we both knew it. Linda's reputation in her social circles mattered to her. The Grieving Widow Act only worked if people believed she was honoring Dad's memory. Marcus finally looked up from his phone. Can we just not do this right now? Dad's been dead for less than a week. Maybe we could try to get along until after the funeral flowers die. His plea for peace might have worked a few days ago,
But too much had been revealed. Too many masks had been ripped away. There was no going back to the pretense of functional family dynamics. "I'm going to pack," I said, heading toward the door. "Pack for what?" Linda called after me. "I'm driving to Tucson tomorrow to meet my grandmother. You know, the manipulative woman who never approved of you. Turns out Dad wanted me to have a relationship with her after all."
I left them in the living room and walked out to the garage, my temporary home that I now realized I'd never have to think of as permanent. The concrete walls and cheerful yellow paint that had felt like exile yesterday now felt like a launching pad. I called Maya first, needing to tell someone about the surreal turn my life had taken. "Wait, back up," she said after I'd rushed through the major plot points. "You're telling me your dad was secretly a millionaire?" "Not exactly a millionaire, but close. The trust fund has been growing for 20 years. And Maya, he left me a letter. He knew exactly what was happening with Linda, and he was sorry about it." That's huge, Jess. I mean, obviously the money is life-changing, but knowing that your dad saw what was really going on, that he regretted not standing up for you more, I hadn't expected how much that validation would mean. For 2 years, I'd questioned my own perceptions, wondered if I was being dramatic about Linda's subtle cruelties and Dad's apparent indifference. Having Dad acknowledge it, even posthumously, felt like a weight lifting off my chest. "There's more," I said. "I'm driving to Tucson tomorrow to meet my grandmother, the one Linda's been keeping me away from." "The one with all your mom's stories?" "Exactly, and Linda can't stop me anymore." After I hung up with Maya, I sat in the yellow garage and looked around at the space that had felt like banishment just hours ago. Now it felt like preparation, a stepping stone between the childhood that had ended when Dad remarried and the adult life that was finally beginning. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number Mr. Patterson had given me. "Bueno?" "Grandma Elena, it's Jessica, your granddaughter." The silence on the other end stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. Then I heard a sharp intake of breath. "Mija, oh Mija, I've been waiting for this call for so long." Her voice was exactly as I remembered, warm, strong, with just a trace of the accent that became more pronounced when she was emotional. "I know Dad told you about the funeral arrangements, but I wanted to call myself. I want to come see you, if that's okay." "If that's okay?" Elena's laugh was rich and delighted. "Jessica, nothing would make me happier. When were you thinking?" "Tomorrow? I know it's short notice, but I just found out. There are things I need to know. About Mom, about Dad, about everything that happened before Linda." "Tomorrow is perfect. I'll make your favorite cookies, the ones with the cinnamon that you used to help me bake when you were little." I had forgotten about those cookies, about standing on a kitchen stool in Elena's bright Tucson kitchen, carefully measuring spices while she told stories about Mom's childhood. Linda had gradually eliminated those visits, citing scheduling conflicts and family obligations that somehow never included Elena. "I'll drive down in the morning," I promised. "Drive carefully, Mija. And Jessica, I'm so proud of the woman you're becoming. Your mother would be proud too." After we hung up, I started packing for real this time. Not the desperate, angry packing I'd done when Marcus took my room, but purposeful preparation for a journey I was choosing to take. I was 18 years old, financially secure, and for the first time in my life, completely free to make my own decisions. And my first decision was to reclaim the parts of my family that Linda had tried to erase. The drive to Tucson took me through a desert landscape that felt like traveling backward through time. With each mile south of Phoenix, the suburban developments gave way to open spaces, punctuated by saguaro cacti and distant mountains. I'd forgotten how much I loved this drive, how the vastness of the desert made my problems feel manageable rather than overwhelming. Elena's house sat in a quiet neighborhood where adobe-style homes were separated by zero-scaped yards full of native plants. The driveway was still lined with the colorful ceramic pots she'd always filled with desert marigolds, and the front door was still painted the same cheerful turquoise I remembered from childhood visits. She opened the door before I could knock, as if she'd been watching for my car.
At 68, Elena Martinez was still a force of nature. Silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, bright eyes that missed nothing, and the kind of posture that suggested she'd never back down from anything in her life.
Mija, she said, and then I was wrapped in arms that smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, exactly the way I remembered. Her kitchen was a time capsule of warmth. Terracotta tiles, hand-painted Mexican ceramics, and windows that let in streams of desert sunlight. The promised cookies were cooling on racks, filling the air with the scent of my childhood. Sit, Elena commanded, already bustling around to prepare coffee. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning and don't leave anything out. So I did. I told her about Linda's gradual takeover of our house, about being pushed to the garage, about feeling like a stranger in my own family. I told her about Dad's death and the shocking reading, about the trust fund I'd never known existed, and the letter that had rewritten my understanding of everything. Elena listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from anger to sadness to something that looked like resignation. Your father, she said finally, setting a perfect cup of café con leche in front of me, was a good man who made complicated choices. Did you know about the trust fund? Elena shook her head. Not the specifics, but I knew David well enough to know he would never leave you unprotected. Your mother made him promise, before she died, that you would always have choices. Financial security meant you could never be trapped by circumstances. She walked to a cabinet and pulled out a photo album I'd never seen before, thick and well-worn, with Catherine and David written on the cover in faded gold lettering. Your mother was the strongest person I ever knew, Elena said, settling beside me on the couch. But she grew up poor, dependent on other people's charity and goodwill. She swore her daughter would never know that kind of vulnerability. She opened the album to reveal photos I'd never seen. Mom as a teenager, laughing with friends. Mom and Dad on their first date, both looking impossibly young. Mom pregnant with me, glowing with happiness as Dad's hands rested on her belly. She was beautiful, I whispered, tracing my finger along a photo of Mom painting at an easel set up in what must have been their first apartment. She was brilliant, corrected. Beautiful, yes, but that was the least interesting thing about Catherine Martinez. She could have been a professional artist if she'd had the financial freedom to pursue it. Instead, she had to work retail jobs to help support your father while he built his accounting practice. I stared at the painting in the photo, an abstract landscape in blues and greens that somehow captured the feeling of water without depicting it literally. It was sophisticated, professional quality work. She painted. Constantly. Your artistic talent comes directly from her. She always said she was painting a better world for you to inherit. Elena turned the page to reveal more photos of Mom's artwork, and I felt something click into place. The trust fund wasn't just about financial security. It was about creative freedom. The freedom to pursue art without worrying about paying rent. The freedom Mom had never had. Why didn't Dad tell me any of this? Elena's expression darkened slightly. Because Linda made it clear from the beginning that Catherine's memory was not welcome in her version of your family. And your father, bless him, was so desperate for stability after losing your mother that he convinced himself keeping peace with Linda was more important than preserving your connection to Catherine. She pulled out another album, this one labeled Jessica's Story, and opened it to reveal photos of me as a baby, as a toddler, always with Mom or Dad or both of them together. Linda didn't want these memories competing with her new family narrative, Elena explained. David probably thought that as long as he protected your financial future, the rest could wait until you were old enough to seek it out yourself. But I almost didn't, I said, thinking about how close I'd come to accepting my exile, to believing Linda's version of our family dynamics. If Dad hadn't died, I might never have known about any of this. You would have, Elena said with conviction. You're too much like your mother to let someone else write your story permanently. It might have taken longer, but you would have found your way back to the truth.
She stood and walked to a closet I hadn't noticed before. When she opened it, I gasped. Inside were easels, canvases, and art supplies, professional-grade materials that must have cost thousands of dollars. Everything was organized meticulously, as if someone had been maintaining an artist's studio in hopeful preparation. "Your mother's things?" I asked. "Some of them, but mostly these are for you. I've been buying supplies for years, hoping that someday you'd come back and want to create again." I walked to the easel, running my fingers along the smooth wood. When was the last time I'd painted anything significant? Not since Linda had redecorated the house and decided my art supplies made the living room look cluttered. "There's something else," Elena said, and her tone made me turn around. She was holding a wooden box that looked hand-carved, with intricate designs that seemed Mexican in origin. "Your mother left this for you, specifically for you, to be given when you turned 18. David was supposed to give it to you on your birthday, but Linda had made sure my 18th birthday was about luggage and exile, not meaningful gifts from my mother's memory." Elena held out the box with steady hands. "It's yours now." The box was heavier than I'd expected and warm to the touch. Inside, nestled in purple velvet, was a necklace I'd never seen before, a pendant made of turquoise and silver in the shape of a butterfly hanging from a delicate chain. Underneath the necklace was a letter addressed to me in Mom's handwriting. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper, the ink still clear and dark after all these years. "My dearest Jessica, if you're reading this, you've reached adulthood without me there to guide you, and my heart breaks knowing I won't see the amazing woman you've become. But I also know that whatever challenges you faced them with strength, because that's who you are." This necklace belonged to my grandmother, who gave it to me when I left home to start my life with your father. She told me it was a reminder that transformation is always possible, that we can reinvent ourselves as many times as necessary to become who we're meant to be. I'm giving it to you now because 18 is when your real life begins. Not the life other people plan for you, but the life you choose for yourself. I know your father will do his best to provide for you, but I also know that security and freedom aren't the same thing. Use both, the security he gives you and the freedom you create for yourself, to build something beautiful. Paint your world, sweetheart. Paint it exactly the way you want it to be. All my love, Mom. I was crying before I finished reading, tears that felt like they'd been building pressure for 8 years. Elena wrapped her arms around me while I sobbed. For my mother, for my father, for all the lost time and missed connections. "She knew," I said when I could speak again. "She knew exactly what I would need to hear." Elena fastened the necklace around my neck, the turquoise butterfly settling perfectly against my chest. "Your mother had a gift for seeing the future," she said. "She always said you would need to find your own way back to your strength." That evening, while Elena prepared her famous green chile enchiladas, I sat up at the easel with supplies that felt like coming home. I'd forgotten the meditative quality of mixing colors, the way time disappeared when brush met canvas. I started painting without a plan, letting muscle memory guide my hand. What emerged was abstract but emotionally clear, a desert landscape in the process of transformation, with a butterfly emerging from a cocoon hidden among the saguaro cacti. "It's beautiful," Elena said, appearing beside me with a cup of tea. "It's cathartic," I corrected. "I'd forgotten how good this feels." "Your mother would be proud." "I think Dad would be too," I said, surprising myself with the realization. He was trying to protect this freedom, even if he couldn't protect the relationship. Elena nodded. "David loved you completely, Mija. He just loved you imperfectly." That night, sleeping in Elena's best room, surrounded by photos of my mother and family history Linda had tried to erase, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of belonging. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, with exactly the tools I needed to build whatever came next. And tomorrow, I will start building it. I spent 3 days in Tucson, 3 days that felt like reclaiming pieces of myself I'd forgotten existed. Elena filled in gaps in my family history that Linda had deliberately created, showed me letters my mother had written during her pregnancy, shared recipes that had been passed down through generations of Martinez women. But it was the practical conversations that proved most valuable. "So, what's your plan, mija?" Elena asked over breakfast on my final morning, watching me sketch in the margins of my notebook while I ate her homemade breakfast burritos.
Honestly, I'm not sure. I know I want to go to art school, but Arizona State doesn't have the program I really want. And now that I can afford it, I trailed off, still adjusting to the reality of financial freedom. Where would you go if money wasn't a factor? Rhode Island School of Design. They have an incredible fine arts program, and their alumni network is amazing. But it's expensive, and it's across the country, and you've been trained to make decisions based on other people's convenience instead of your own dreams, Elena finished. Sound familiar? It did sound familiar. It sounded exactly like the trap my mother had described in her letter, the one she'd tried to protect me from with the trust fund. RISD would mean leaving Arizona completely, I said. Good. Arizona will still be here when you're ready to come back. If you're ever ready to come back. The idea of leaving, really leaving, felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I'd been so focused on surviving my current situation that I'd never seriously considered escaping it entirely. What about Linda and Marcus, the house situation? Elena's expression hardened slightly. What about them? You have legal rights to stay in that house, but you also have the financial means to live anywhere you want. Why would you choose to stay somewhere you're not wanted? Because it's my father's house, because it's where I grew up. It's not your father's house anymore, mija. It's Linda's house now. And the place where you grew up stopped being your home the moment she made you feel like a guest in it. The truth of that statement hit harder than I'd expected. When had I last felt genuinely at home in that Phoenix house? Not since Dad's remarriage, certainly. Maybe not even since Mom died, and we'd moved there to start fresh. You're right, I admitted. I've been thinking about it as my home, but it hasn't felt like home in years. Then make a new home, somewhere that's entirely yours, where no one can make you feel unwelcome or unwanted. That afternoon, I called the admissions office at RISD. Classes had already started for the fall semester, but they had rolling admissions for spring, and my portfolio was strong enough that they encouraged me to apply immediately. The application deadline was in 6 weeks. If accepted, I could start fresh in January in Providence, Rhode Island, about as far from Linda's redesigned family as I could get while staying in the continental United States. The drive back to Phoenix felt different than the drive down. Instead of fleeing towards something, I was returning with purpose. I had plans now, concrete steps toward a future that belonged entirely to me. But first, I had to deal with the storage unit. The facility was on the outskirts of Phoenix, a sprawling complex of beige metal buildings that looked like they'd been designed to house secrets. Unit 247 was in the back corner, secured with a padlock that had been undisturbed for 2 years. When I opened the door, the smell hit me first. Not musty or stale, but somehow preserved, like opening a time capsule. Dad had climate-controlled the unit, kept Mom's things in perfect condition, even while Linda was systematically removing her presence from our daily lives. There were boxes labeled in Dad's careful handwriting: Catherine's clothes, art supplies, books, personal items. But there were also things I hadn't expected. Furniture I remembered from our old house, pieces Linda had claimed were donated when she redecorated. Mom's easel, the one I'd learned to paint on. Her reading chair, a butter-soft leather recliner where she'd spent hours with books and sketch pads. A cedar chest I remembered from my childhood but hadn't seen in years. I opened the chest first, finding treasures I'd assumed were lost forever. Photo albums chronicling my early childhood, my parents' courtship, family vacations to places I'd forgotten we'd visited. Mom's jewelry box with pieces I remembered her wearing. A baby book filled with Mom's looping handwriting. But it was the art supplies that took my breath away. Box after box of professional materials. Oils, watercolors, charcoal, pastels, brushes in every size.
Canvases stretched and primed, sketchbooks filled with Mom's drawings and studies. She'd been good, really good. Looking through her sketchbooks, I could see technical skill that matched her artistic vision. These weren't hobby sketches. They were the work of someone who could have been a professional artist if circumstances had been different. In one sketchbook, I found drawings of me as a baby, captured with the kind of loving attention that made my throat tight. Mom nursing me, playing with me, watching me sleep. Each drawing was annotated with dates and little notes. Jessica's first smile, discovering her toes, Daddy's girl.
The final sketchbook contained something that stopped me cold. Studies for a painting I'd never seen, with a note in Mom's handwriting, for Jessica's 18th birthday. Butterfly dreams. She'd been planning my 18th birthday gift 8 years ago, before she died. A painting of butterflies emerging from cocoons, transforming into creatures of impossible beauty against a background that somehow captured both desert landscape and infinite sky. The painting itself wasn't finished. I found it wrapped carefully in a box marked Jessica's Future. But the preliminary work was exquisite, showing exactly the kind of artistic maturity I was striving for in my own work. I sat in that storage unit, surrounded by the remnants of my mother's abbreviated life, and cried until my chest ached. Not just for her death, but for all the conversations we'd never had, all the artistic advice she'd never been able to give me, all the encouragement she'd never been able to offer during the difficult years with Linda. But also for the incredible gift she'd left me, not just financial security, but creative lineage. I came from artists. I came from women who understood the necessity of beauty, who fought for the freedom to create it. When I finally composed myself, I started making decisions about what to take and what to leave. Most of Mom's clothes could be donated, but I kept a few special pieces: her painting smocks, a silk scarf I remembered her wearing, a sweater that still somehow held traces of her perfume. I packed the art supplies carefully in my car, along with the photo albums and the unfinished painting. These were coming with me to Rhode Island, if I got accepted. They would be the foundation of whatever artistic life I built for myself. It was nearly dark when I finished, but I had one more stop to make. The Phoenix Community Bank had a safety deposit box registered under my name, according to the paperwork Mr. Patterson had given me. Another surprise from Dad's careful planning. Inside the box were documents I'd never seen: my birth certificate, my parents' marriage license, my mother's death certificate. But also a thick envelope marked for Jessica's college fund in Dad's handwriting. Inside were savings bonds, purchased every year since my birth, steadily accumulating value. Not as dramatic as the trust fund, but another layer of security, another way Dad had been quietly ensuring my future independence. There was also a key I didn't recognize, attached to a tag that read, Catherine's Studio, 1247 Desert Willow Lane. A studio? Mom had had a studio that I'd never known about. I drove to the address at twilight, following GPS through a part of Phoenix I rarely visited. 1247 Desert Willow Lane turned out to be a small adobe building behind a house, probably originally designed as a guest house, but converted into an artist's workspace. The key fit perfectly. Inside was a time capsule more complete than the storage unit. Mom's easel stood exactly where she'd left it, with a half-finished landscape still clipped to it. Her palette knife lay beside tubes of paint that had long since hardened. Finished paintings lined the walls: portraits, landscapes, abstract pieces that showed a range and sophistication I was only beginning to understand. But what stopped me in my tracks was the wall of sketches, clearly depicting a life she'd planned for me. Jessica is learning to drive. Jessica graduated high school. Jessica in a wedding dress. Jessica holding a baby. Jessica as an old woman, painting at an easel with silver hair and smile lines earned through decades of joy. She'd imagined my entire life, had envisioned me growing up happy and fulfilled, and free to make my own choices. The trust fund wasn't just about money.
It was about ensuring that the future she'd drawn for me could actually happen. I found a note tacked to the wall beside the easel, written in Mom's careful script. For my daughter, who will paint her world more beautifully than I ever could. The rent is paid through your 21st birthday. Use this space to create miracles. 3 more years of studio space. 3 more years of connection to my mother's artistic legacy. I stood in that sacred space as darkness fell outside, understanding finally that every decision Dad had made, every seemingly small choice about trust funds and storage units and safety deposit boxes, had been leading to this moment. This understanding that I wasn't just inheriting money, I was inheriting possibility, and I was finally ready to claim it. When I returned to the house that night, Linda was waiting in the living room with a bottle of wine and what appeared to be a carefully rehearsed speech. The dining room table was set for 3, and I could smell something elaborate cooking in the kitchen. "Jessica, perfect timing," she said, her voice carrying forced brightness. "I was hoping we could have a family dinner and discuss everything. Clear the air, you know?" Marcus appeared from the kitchen, looking uncomfortable in a button-down shirt that was clearly Linda's idea. "Hey, Jess, Mom thought it would be good if we all talked." I stood in the doorway, car keys still in my hand, and felt the surreal disconnect between Linda's sudden hospitality and the bitter confrontation we'd had 3 days ago. Nothing had fundamentally changed, except the balance of power, and we all knew it. "What exactly did you want to discuss?" I asked, not moving toward the dining room. Linda's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Well, the living arrangements, for one thing. I know you have every right to stay here, and I want you to know that you're welcome. This is your home, too." The words were right, but the delivery felt like a performance. Linda had clearly spent my absence calculating her options and decided that cooperation was more strategic than confrontation. "I appreciate that," I said carefully, "but I won't be staying much longer regardless." "Oh," Linda's relief was barely concealed. "Did you find an apartment?" "I'm applying to an art school in Rhode Island. If I get accepted, I'll be leaving in January." The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken implications. Marcus looked genuinely surprised, but Linda's expression was harder to read, relief warring with something that might have been concerned about how my departure would look to outsiders. "Rhode Island is very far away," she said finally. "Are you sure that's wise? You've never lived anywhere but Phoenix." "My mother lived in New York before she met Dad. I think I can handle Rhode Island." The mention of my mother shifted the atmosphere in the room. Linda's carefully constructed dinner party mood deflated visibly. "Jessica, about what I said the other day," she began, her voice losing its artificial brightness. "I was upset about the will, about finding out about the trust fund. I said things I shouldn't have said." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was closer than I'd ever gotten from Linda. I studied her face, trying to determine if this was genuine remorse or damage control. "You said Mom was dead, and I needed to get over it," I replied. "You said I made it impossible for Dad to be happy." Linda flinched. I was angry. I felt like David had betrayed me by keeping such a significant financial secret. I took that anger out on you, and that wasn't fair. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. "Maybe we could just eat dinner and figure out how to make the next few months work for everyone." His suggestion of temporary coexistence was probably the most reasonable approach, but I found myself reluctant to fall back into old patterns, even modified ones. I'd spent 3 days remembering what it felt like to be genuinely welcomed somewhere, to have my thoughts and feelings treated as important. I wasn't eager to walking on eggshells. "I think it would be better if I stayed at Mom's studio," I said, the decision crystallizing as I spoke. "At least until I leave for school." "Studio?" Linda's confusion seemed genuine. "Mom had an art studio that Dad kept paying rent on. It's got everything I need, and it'll give everyone space to adjust." Relief flooded Linda's face so completely that any pretense of wanting me to stay evaporated. If that's what you think is best, she said quickly, we certainly don't want you to feel constrained. Constrained. It was a careful word choice, diplomatically avoiding any acknowledgement of how constrained I'd felt living under her rules. That evening, I packed my essentials and moved to Mom's studio. The space felt sacred after so many years of being sealed away, but it also felt alive, like it had been waiting for someone to resume the work that had been interrupted. I spent my first night there going through Mom's paintings with new eyes. Now that I understood her training and technical skill, I could see influences I'd missed before. Hints of Georgia O'Keeffe in her desert landscapes, echoes of Helen Frankenthaler in her color field abstracts. She'd been studying the masters, developing her own voice within established traditions. More importantly, I could see how her work had evolved during the years she'd had this studio. The earlier pieces were more tentative, technically proficient, but searching for personal expression. The later works showed increasing confidence, a willingness to take risks and push boundaries. The last painting she'd completed was a self-portrait unlike anything else in the studio. Instead of depicting herself realistically, she'd painted herself as a tree, roots deep in desert soil, branches reaching toward an infinite sky, with small butterflies emerging from among the leaves. It was breathtaking and heartbreaking, a meditation on transformation and growth that felt prophetic given what I now knew about her hopes for my future. I set up my own easel beside hers and started working on something I'd been envisioning since my conversation with Elena. Not a copy of Mom's work, but a dialogue with it. A painting that acknowledged her artistic legacy while establishing my own voice.
Over the next 2 weeks, I fell into a rhythm that felt more natural than any routine I'd followed in years. I woke early, painted until afternoon, then spent evenings working on my RISD application portfolio and researching art programs. Maya visited frequently, amazed by the transformation in my work and my outlook. "You seem different," she observed one afternoon, watching me mix colors for a landscape that was somehow both abstract and representational. More settled, if that makes sense. "I feel like myself again," I said, adding a touch of cadmium orange to capture the way desert light hit sandstone. "Or maybe like myself for the first time. Does that make sense?" "Totally. You've been trying to fit into Linda's version of who you should be for so long, I don't think any of us remembered who you actually were." The comment stung a little because of its truth. I had lost myself in the daily negotiations of living with Linda, had become so focused on survival that I'd forgotten about growth. "What's crazy is that Dad knew this would happen," I said, stepping back to evaluate my progress. "He knew I'd need this space, this freedom, this connection to Mom's work. He planned for it without ever telling me." "That's actually kind of romantic," Maya said, "like he was having a conversation with your mom's memory, trying to honor what she would have wanted for you." I'd never thought of it that way, but Maya was right. The trust fund, the studio rent, the carefully preserved belongings, they weren't just practical provisions. They were Dad's way of keeping faith with promises he'd made to my mother before she died. My RISD application went in 2 days before the deadline. My portfolio was the strongest work I'd ever produced, a combination of technical skill and emotional honesty that I hadn't achieved before living in Mom's studio. Whether it would be enough remained to be seen, but I was proud of what I'd submitted. The response came faster than I'd expected. A thick envelope in my mailbox 6 weeks later, the kind that usually meant good news. I tore it open standing beside my car, too nervous to wait until I got inside. "Dear Miss Martinez, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into the Rhode Island School of Design's Bachelor of Fine Arts program beginning with the spring 2026 semester." Accepted. Not just accepted, but with a partial scholarship based on the strength of my portfolio. I called Elena first, then Maya, then sat in Mom's studio surrounded by the paintings that had taught me who I was meant to be, and cried with relief and excitement and terror. I was leaving Phoenix. I was leaving Linda's carefully controlled environment and Marcus's uncomfortable mediation attempts and the house that had never quite felt like home. I was going to study art at one of the most prestigious programs in the country, funded by money my parents had saved specifically for this kind of opportunity.
But leaving meant conversations I'd been avoiding. Linda took the news with grace that seemed genuinely relieved rather than performed. "Rhode Island will be good for you," she said when I told her over coffee at a neutral cafe. "A fresh start, new experiences, it's exactly what someone your age should be doing." We both understood what she wasn't saying, that my departure would allow her to fully establish the family dynamic she'd wanted since marrying Dad. Marcus could spread into the whole house, her decorating choices wouldn't compete with memories of my mother, and she could stop feeling guilty about displacing the daughter who'd been there first. "I want you to know," she continued, "that despite our difficulties, I do wish you well. You're a talented young woman, and you deserve to build the life you want." It wasn't exactly warmth, but it was acknowledgement. Linda was offering a truce based on geographical separation, and I was prepared to accept it. Marcus was harder to leave than I'd expected. Despite being Linda's son and the beneficiary of my displacement, he'd never been deliberately cruel, just thoughtlessly privileged. Our goodbye was awkward but genuine. "I'm sorry about the room thing," he said, standing in the driveway beside my packed car. "I didn't really think about what it meant to you at the time." "You were 15, I replied. 15-year-olds don't usually think about displacement politics." "Still, I know it sucked for you." "It did, but it led to other things. Better things, maybe." Elena drove up from Tucson to see me off, bringing a care package of homemade cookies and a promise to visit me in Providence once I was settled. "Your mother would be so proud," she said, hugging me beside my car loaded with art supplies and dreams. "Not just because you're going to art school, but because you found your way back to yourself." "I had help," I said, thinking about the trust fund, the studio, the carefully preserved memories that had guided me toward this moment. "The best help just shows you what was already there," Elena replied. "Your strength, your talent, your determination, those were never inherited. Those are yours." The drive to Rhode Island took 3 days, with stops to see parts of the country I'd never experienced. I drove through Colorado mountains that made my desert landscapes look small, across Great Plains that stretched beyond imagination, through forests in Pennsylvania that looked like something from fairy tales. RISD's campus in Providence was everything I'd hoped for. Historic brick buildings mixed with cutting-edge studios. Students carrying portfolios and discussing techniques with the intensity I remembered from my best art classes. The smell of paint and clay and possibility filled the air. My dorm room was tiny but mine, with windows overlooking a courtyard where sculpture students worked on massive installations. I unpacked carefully, setting up my mother's butterfly necklace on my desk where I could see it while I worked. My first painting class met in a studio with north-facing windows and enough easels for 20 students. Our professor, a woman in her 50s with paint-stained fingers and fierce intelligence, asked us to introduce ourselves by describing the single most important influence on our artistic development. When my turn came, I thought about Linda's redecorating projects, about Dad's silent protection, about the garage exile that had led to this moment. "My mother died when I was 10, I said, but she left me a studio full of paintings and the financial means to pursue art seriously. I spent 8 years not knowing about either gift. The most important influence on my art is learning that love sometimes expresses itself through long-term planning rather than daily presence." After class, I walked through Providence's historic district, past coffee shops and galleries, and young people pursuing dreams in every direction. I bought a sketchbook from an art supply store and sat in a park, drawing the city skyline while thinking about the journey that had brought me here. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hope you're settling in well. Dad would be proud. Linda." It was the first time she'd ever referred to David as my dad rather than her husband in a communication to me. Small gesture, but significant. I texted back, "Thank you. I think he would be too." That evening, I set up my easel in my dorm room and started a new painting. Not a desert landscape or a family portrait, but something entirely forward-looking. A young woman standing at an easel, paintbrush in hand, with an open window behind her, showing not what was, but what could be. I painted until midnight, then fell asleep surrounded by the scent of oils and possibility, the butterfly necklace catching moonlight from my desk. For the first time since my mother died, I was exactly where I belonged. The trust fund had given me security, but I'd given myself freedom. The studio had connected me to my artistic heritage, but I was creating my own legacy. Dad's protection had made this possible, but my choices had made it real. I was 18 years old, finally independent, and ready to paint my world exactly the way I wanted it to be. Just like Mom had always planned. 6 months into my first semester at RISD, I received a call that would complete the circle of my transformation in ways I never could have anticipated. I was in the printmaking studio, working on a series of etchings inspired by desert landscapes viewed through the lens of New England seasons, when my phone rang with a Phoenix area code I didn't recognize. Jessica Martinez? The voice was professional, unfamiliar. Speaking? This is Janet Morrison from Morrison Real Estate. I'm calling about a property inquiry regarding 1247 Desert Willow Lane. Mom's studio. My heart rate spiked immediately. What kind of inquiry? The property owner is looking to sell, and they wanted to offer you first right of refusal before listing it publicly. I understand you've been renting the studio space. The property owner? I'd never thought to ask Elena, who actually owned the building where Mom had worked, had simply assumed it was some faceless landlord collecting Dad's monthly payments. I'm sorry, who is the property owner? Elena Martinez. She said you were her granddaughter and might be interested in purchasing. Elena owned Mom's studio. Elena had been Dad's silent partner in preserving my mother's workspace, had been collecting rent payments that she probably didn't need, maintaining a space she'd known I would eventually discover. Another layer of protection I hadn't even known existed.
Can I call you back? I managed. I need to discuss this with my grandmother. Elena answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting. Mija, you got the call. You own the studio. I bought it 20 years ago when your mother needed a workspace but couldn't afford the rent. She insisted on paying me back through monthly payments and said it was important to her to earn her artistic space rather than accept charity. I sat down heavily on a bench outside the printmaking studio, trying to process yet another revelation about the intricate web of support that had surrounded my childhood without my knowledge. So when Dad was paying rent, he was paying me, and I was putting every penny into a savings account earmarked for you. The rent money, plus 20 years of compound interest, comes to just about enough to buy the property outright. My mother had been paying for her own studio. Dad had continued those payments as a way of honoring her memory. Elena had been quietly saving every dollar for 2 decades, waiting for the moment when I would be ready to claim my inheritance, not just financially, but emotionally and artistically. Elena, I can't. I'm in school. I don't know where I'll end up after graduation. Which is exactly why you should own it, she interrupted gently. Real estate is an investment, Mija, but more than that, it's roots. Someday you might want to come back to Arizona, might want to have a connection to your mother's artistic legacy that no one can take away from you. I walked across Providence's campus while she talked, past students discussing philosophy and literature and art, and felt the strange sensation of existing in 2 worlds simultaneously. My present, which was all forward momentum and new experiences and artistic growth, and my past, which kept revealing itself to be far more carefully constructed and loving than I'd realized. What if I can't maintain it from Rhode Island? I'll maintain it, just like I have been. Consider me your property manager until you're ready to decide what to do with it long term. That evening, I called my advisor, Professor Chen, who'd become something of a mentor during my first semester. She listened while I explained the unexpected opportunity, asked practical questions about financing and long-term planning. It sounds like you're being offered something quite rare, she said finally. Not just property ownership, but a physical connection to your artistic lineage. That kind of continuity can be invaluable for an artist's development. But I don't know if I want to be tied to Arizona forever. What if my career takes me to New York or Los Angeles or internationally? Then you rent it to another artist who needs affordable studio space. You maintain it as a legacy workspace. You use it as a retreat when you need to reconnect with your roots. Professor Chen paused.
Jessica, most artists spend their entire careers looking for the kind of workspace your mother created. The fact that it's being offered to you with such personal history attached, that's not something you should dismiss lightly. I made the decision that night, sitting in my dorm room with acceptance letters from summer art programs spread across my desk. The studio purchase would use up a significant portion of my available trust fund money, but Elena was right. It was an investment, not just an expense. More importantly, it felt like completing something my mother had started, honoring not just her memory, but her vision of what an artist's life could look like with the right support and planning. The paperwork was handled remotely, with Elena managing the Phoenix end of the transaction. By spring break, I officially owned my mother's studio, becoming a property owner at 18 in a way that would have been impossible without the trust fund. I flew back to Phoenix for the first time since leaving for school, nervous about how it would feel to return to a place I'd worked so hard to escape. The city looked smaller than I remembered, the desert landscapes I'd been painting from memory somehow less dramatic than my homesick imagination had made them. But Mom's studio felt exactly right, like stepping into a conversation I'd been having with her across time and distance. Elena had indeed maintained it perfectly, dusting the easels and ensuring the paintings remained stable in the dry climate, but she'd also made subtle additions: a small refrigerator, a coffee maker, updated lighting that would make working in the evenings more practical. For when you come home to paint, she explained, as if my periodic returns were a foregone conclusion. We spent 3 days together, Elena sharing more stories about Mom's artistic development, while I painted in the space that was now legally mine. It felt surreal to be working at my mother's easel in a studio I owned, funded by money my parents had saved for exactly this kind of freedom.
On my final evening in Phoenix, I drove by the house where I'd grown up. Linda had made more changes: new landscaping, a pool house addition, subtle modifications that further erased any trace of my family's previous residence there. I felt nothing driving past it: no nostalgia, no resentment, no sense of loss. It was simply a house where other people lived now, as distant from my current reality as a childhood photograph. The realization was liberating. I'd been carrying Phoenix as a wound for months, but returning as an adult with my own resources and plans had transformed it into just another city where I happened to have history. Back at RISD for my final semester of freshman year, I threw myself into work with renewed focus. The studio ownership had given me something I hadn't expected: a sense of permanence, of belonging to a tradition larger than myself. My paintings evolved dramatically. Where I'd previously focused on landscapes and abstracts, I began incorporating elements that spoke to the complexity of family legacy, of inherited dreams, of young women claiming space in artistic traditions dominated by older voices. One piece in particular caught Professor Chen's attention: a large canvas depicting a young woman painting at an easel, but with multiple transparent layers showing the same figure at different ages, in different settings, as if all the possibilities of an artistic life were happening simultaneously. "This is sophisticated work, Jessica," she said during our end-of-semester critique. "You're dealing with themes of time and legacy and artistic inheritance in ways that show real conceptual maturity." "I've been thinking about how we become artists," I replied. "How much of it is personal talent versus inherited opportunity versus other people's planning and sacrifice?" "And what have you concluded?" "That it's all of those things, but ultimately we still have to choose what to do with what we're given." Professor Chen nodded approvingly. "That kind of insight will serve you well as your work develops. Have you given any thought to summer opportunities?" I had, actually. Several prestigious programs had accepted me, including a residency in Italy that would have been incredible for my artistic development, but I'd made a different choice. "I'm going to spend the summer in Phoenix, working in my mother's studio. I want to create a body of work that responds directly to her paintings, using her space and materials to understand how artistic voice develops across generations." It wasn't the most glamorous option, but it felt like the most honest one. I had resources, opportunities, freedom that many artists never achieve. But I also had questions about identity and inheritance that could only be explored by going deeper into my family's artistic legacy rather than running from it. Professor Chen smiled. "That sounds like exactly the kind of project that produces breakthrough work. Will you be working alone?"
Mostly, but my grandmother is planning to visit, and she has stories about my mother's artistic development that I've never heard. I want to record those stories while I paint, create a kind of oral history alongside the visual work. Document the process carefully, she advised. Work like that, especially with personal and cultural significance, can become the foundation for graduate applications, exhibition proposals, even book projects. The future she was describing, exhibitions, graduate school, serious artistic career, felt both thrilling and surreal. A year ago, I'd been sleeping in a converted garage, believing my artistic ambitions were secondary to everyone else's priorities. Now I was planning a summer artistic residency in a studio I owned, funded by money specifically saved for my creative development, with the support of professors who believed in my potential. As I packed my dorm room in May, preparing to return to Phoenix for a summer of intensive work, I found myself thinking about the strange architecture of privilege I'd inherited. Not just money, though that was transformative, but also vision, my parents' ability to imagine a future where their daughter could pursue art without financial anxiety. The butterfly necklace my mother had left me caught the light as I wrapped it carefully for travel. A symbol of transformation, she'd written, a reminder that we can reinvent ourselves as many times as necessary to become who we're meant to be. I was returning to Phoenix not as the displaced teenager who'd fled 8 months earlier, but as a young artist with resources, education, and most importantly, clarity about who I was becoming. The trust fund had given me security. The studio had given me a connection to my artistic heritage. RISD has given me technical skills and conceptual framework. But the synthesis of all those gifts into something uniquely mine, that was the work I would be doing all summer in the desert light where my mother had learned to paint her dreams into reality. I was finally ready to paint mine. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.